Here is Keir Starmer himself talking about using extra private sector capacity in the NHS.
And finally, to cut waiting times as dramatically as possible. Our approach must be totally unburdened by dogma. Working people will expect nothing less. So today, I welcome a new agreement that will expand the relationship between the NHS and the private healthcare sector, make the spaces, the facilities and resources of private hospitals more readily available to the NHS. That's more beds, more operations, more care, available to the NHS, treating patients free at the point of use, targeted at where we need them most.
There's a reason why he starts off this by saying it must be unburdened by dogma. Because as far as the Labour right are concerned, they can justify their relationships with the private healthcare sector by decrying everybody who disagrees with them as only doing things because they believe it's wrong on principle. I do believe it's wrong on principle, but it's also bad in terms of utility as well. So that's why I'll only make utilitarian arguments against the use of the private healthcare sector, because it's more expensive and you get worse results. It's as simple as that. The irony, of course, is that the real dogma is what comes from the Labour right, which is essentially, well, whatever the Labour left believe in, that must be wrong because they're Trotskyists and student politicians who believe in politics as protest rather than power. They were talking in the run-up to the election about how they were going to utilise the private sector to bring waiting lists down. They said that was what they were going to do. It's not going to happen for reasons I will outline, but that was the line they were going with. So it shouldn't be surprising to anybody who voted Labour, who supports Labour, or doesn't even like Labour, that when they got into government, their first thing they would do with the NHS, therefore, would be to look at how much they can get more private sector involvement. This is despite, of course, completely antithetical to the principles that Keir Starmer laid down when running for Labour leader. Said the NHS should be in public hands, not in private hands. Said that we should end outsourcing in the NHS. That was one of his pledges. But of course, you know, who would Keir Starmer be if not a liar about everything that he believes and he supports? In the run-up to the election 2022-2023, both Wes Streeting and Keir Starmer were open about the fact they were going to use extra private sector provision in the NHS. That was never going to be something they weren't going to do, especially after appointing Alan Milburn, Blairite super ghoul, into their health and social care department. Like, this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, but it doesn't make it not bad. It's still bad. It's what the country voted for, so they're going to get it, but it's bad. Like, it's very bad. So here's a Guardian article about the plans that they have got coming forward. And the private sector role in cutting NHS waiting lists is going to be increased by 20%. Private hospitals will provide NHS patients in England with as many as 1 million extra appointments, scans and operations a year as part of the government's drive to end the care backlog. The move represents a significant expansion of the independent sector's role in helping the health service tackle the long waits for treatment that built up under the Conservatives. Interesting that even the Labour Party now, and The Guardian as well, whilst reporting on the Labour Party, are using the term independent sector rather than private sector, because you'll notice that Richard Tice and Nigel Farage, all the Reform UK lot, and plenty on the Conservative benches too, they all have started saying independent rather than private. They know that private sector as a term has a bad rap. They know that it's poor optics. So they have opted to say independent healthcare providers or independent schools rather than saying private healthcare and private schools, because people don't like the private sector in this country. It's interesting that they have to hide the things they believe in. And Guardian is just picking up the verbiage here. No, they are private. That's what they are. They are in the private sector. It is private healthcare. And also, I don't buy this idea that there's going to be 1 million extra appointments because of private healthcare being used by the state, when the vast majority of the private healthcare sector in this country is staffed by people from the NHS and use the facilities that the NHS owns. So you can't get extra appointments with staff that are already working in the NHS. If anything, if they are going to be all these extra appointments, that's going to become from NHS staff doing overtime in the private sector. That's going to be things they've elected to do extra on top of their usual hours for the extra money that they get paid more of in the private sector. So we're essentially paying extra for the same thing the NHS is providing with the same staff and the same facilities. Because it's mostly, as I said, the same facilities and the same staff in the private sector that work in the NHS doing things alongside their NHS work on like locum contracts and things like that. Keir Starmer unveiled the NHS's growing use of private healthcare in a major speech on Monday in which he set out his new elective reform plan to address waiting lists for planned care, in which 6.4 million people are waiting for 7.5 million treatments. Private operators will receive an extra £2.5 billion a year in government funding, taking the total to almost £16 billion if they can deliver the uplifts in care and treatment the Prime Minister outlined. The initiative is a key element in a plan intended to ensure that patients no longer have to wait more than 18 weeks for non-urgent hospital care by spring 2029. That is a huge amount extra to be spending on the private healthcare sector. When Ben says, we will encourage long-term contractual relationships to be established, is essentially saying, as you say, there will now be a permanent reliance on the private sector for delivering NHS services. Permanent reliance. A long-term establishment of a contract just means continually shoveling money into the private sector parasitic sector. And that is not a good thing, because it's more expensive and less efficient. But shareholders, they're laughing all the way to the bank. And especially what this is trying to do, because this is what Reform UK's plan was to offer people vouchers to go private if they couldn't be seen within a certain amount of time in the NHS. What this is there for, it's a signal. It's a bat signal to people who want to invest in private sector healthcare, saying there is free government money available to you. There is free government money available if you start investing in private healthcare, which we are looking to expand by quite a large amount as well, which will involve more competition between NHS staff and private sector staff. It's going to involve more shifting of NHS responsibility to the private sector. It's still free at the point of use. It's still funded by general taxation, the two principles that West Streeting and Keir Starmer like to continue telling us is their foundational principles, because they're not breaking any of these things just by shoveling public money to private contracts. It's just a complete and fundamental rejection of the basic tenets of the socialism that the Labour Party is supposed to represent. Clause 4 was about the democratic worker control of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. State money going into private hands is not that. That's the opposite of that. Don't forget BlackRock's healthcare practice aims to meet the complex investing challenges of hospital and healthcare systems, also creating the markets. It is interesting that BlackRock are looking to get investing into the healthcare sector, the private healthcare sector specifically, just at the time when Labour are looking to offer new money to the private healthcare sector, and just at the same time as Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer were sitting at the same table as Larry Fink and posting glowing reviews of their time together with BlackRock on social media. Because they can use as much private sector provision as they want. It doesn't break what they said before the election about it being free at the point of use and paid for through general taxation. The relationship between the NHS and the private sector has become so entwined that private hospitals now carry out almost 1 in 5 health service funded operations on people stuck on the waiting list. They already undertake about a quarter of all hip and knee replacements performed on NHS patients, and the same proportion of ophthalmic interventions such as cataract removals. The extra capacity that the NHS and private sector partnership agreement is expected to produce will help the health service cut waiting times for people facing particularly long delays for certain types of care, notably gynecology and orthopaedic treatment. Again, I do not believe one word of this. I genuinely do not believe a single word of what's being said here. Because again, a lot of these things are just NHS staff and NHS facilities. I wonder what happens when you give long-running contracts without constant review and targets to an industry. Whatever you don't do, look at the rail industry as an example. Well, exactly. Remember the article that Novara Media broke about Avanti West Coast in board meetings saying that they were being given free money by the government? They had like an infinite money glitch. That's essentially what the private sector are being given here. Where is the safeguarding? Where at all is any amount of stipulations on level of service provision to be able to get value for money for these government contracts? Whereas we could be taking all of this new money that's being spent on private sector provision as part of capital investment to expand capacity of the NHS to ensure that we create more space to do more appointments to bring waiting lists down. If you pay for a private sector contract, that's money you've spaffed up the wall into the pockets of shareholders. That money doesn't go back into capital investment in the NHS. That doesn't give us long-term sustainability. It is, to quote a great man, sticking plaster politics. The co-chair of Keep Our NHS Public, Dr. Tony O'Sullivan, said the private sector was a parasite that was damaging the health service and they would lose out as a result of the deal because its own staff would provide most of the expansion of private care. Just as in the 2000s, the NHS could provide those million appointments and build sustainable capacity if funding was invested to reopen theatres, provide equipment, support more NHS GPs and community and hospital staff, he said. That is value for money. Keir Starmer claims to set ideology aside whilst choosing to invest in expensive long-term private sector contracts. Private spare capacity relies on NHS staff and funding to resource their expansion. And it's parasitic. That's exactly why it's parasitic, and he's correct, Mr. O'Sullivan is. Do you think they're investing the right amount of money in the wrong places then, or is funding level also an issue? Both. Like, money that's being spent on private sector contracts rather than on new investment in expanding the NHS capacity, that is also wasted money that could also be more as well. I think that we will need more spending to be able to undo the damage of austerity. Then we can reduce spending later on once we've got the waiting lists down. But fundamentally, until we actually get a grip on waiting lists and we actually get people healthy again, there probably isn't an upper limit, as far as I'm concerned, on how much money we can spend to get these things down. Because that can always come down later once we've managed to fix the problems. But whilst we have those problems, it's all going to continue to compound in increased costs long term, the longer that we let these long waiting lists continue. And, of course, it'll be cheaper and more efficient once you stop the outsourcing. If you actually invest in expanding NHS capacity that's owned by the state, you will pay less overall money to be able to get those operational than having to pay for all of the operational costs of the private sector, plus, on top of that, paying for all of the private sector profits and also paying for all of the private sector's administrative costs. Keir Starmer's choice is to ignore the soaring profits enjoyed by the private sector operating on NHS patients for routine cataract surgery, whilst NHS eye departments lose that funding and their staff are unable to treat many patients with other sight-threatening conditions in time. The private sector needs NHS funding to be diverted and NHS staff to reduce their NHS hours to staff spare capacity. Feeding the parasite undermines the health of the NHS host. 100%. And here, if you needed any more evidence that this is going to be happening for a long time, and the private sector parasite will not be so easily cleaved away at a later date, the longer it becomes one and the same with the NHS provision, this is the chair of the Independent Healthcare Providers Network, otherwise known as the Private Sector Parasite Gang, David Hare. And he said the new agreement was a clear statement from the government, the NHS and independent sector and independent providers are a critical part of the NHS's long-term recovery and renewal. It's plain as day. That is somebody who is speaking as a representative of the private healthcare sector, saying that they see themselves working with the government long-term and cannibalising the public's money to be using for their profits and their shareholders and their directors' salaries. And here is Kat Hobbs, who is the chair of We Own It, which is a pressure group for public ownership, and I very much support her work, talking about Keir Starmer's plans.
If you and your family rely on the NHS, it's really important that you understand this. Keir Starmer has just announced a plan for NHS waiting lists that is bad for patients and good for private healthcare profits. Here are the 3 things he should have done instead. Number 1, he should buy out private sector capacity to build up the NHS. This has already happened in Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells, where the NHS Trust has bought a private hospital to expand NHS capacity and see patients more efficiently. The private sector only has a tiny bit of capacity anyway, and the only way of releasing that is using NHS staff. The best, most efficient way to expand NHS capacity is to expand NHS capacity, either directly or by buying private sector capacity wherever that's possible. Number 2, Starmer should be bringing all outsourced contracts back into the NHS. That would save around £10 million a week currently being wasted on private profits. That money is enough to build a new NHS operating theatre in an NHS hospital every single week.
Really important to reiterate. This was a pledge in Keir Starmer's leadership election for the Labour Party. He pledged to end all outsourcing in the NHS. He pledged to do so. And now he is not just breaking that pledge, but to do the complete opposite, to increase outsourcing. But I guess that's what having a bunch of people from the lobbying sector as MPs does to your political principles.
Number 3, Starmer should be saying no new PFI, no new private finance initiative style deals that lock in the NHS to having to pay out huge sums to the private sector for facilities that could have been bought within the public sector for much lower cost. This is a waste of money, and the impact is that patients have less resources available to be looked after by the NHS. Starmer is opening up the NHS to more privatisation when he promised to build back better, and when Wes Streeting promised not to privatise the NHS. If you want our NHS to be our NHS, share this video.
And you should go and follow Kat Hobbs over on TikTok, and you should follow her on Twitter. I will put her link in the description and any other socials that she has. And you should also go and follow We Own It as well. We're an excellent pressure group, as I said, who talk about public ownership. They've done some really great work on the NHS, on the rail network, on local authorities, outsourcing as well. Really, really good stuff. She's great. John Bosco and Wogbo, someone else I think you should follow too. I'll put the links in the description for you later on. Big fans of them both. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.